South Korea's economy is one of the most outstanding performers out there today. People praise the leaders of Korea for their miracle on the Han River, which brought one of the world's least developed countries into a developed one, which rivaled many of those in the West. But one of the contributors to South Korea's economic model was the low use of government debt. Here's a graph of South Korea's general government debt to GDP with data published by the International Monetary Fund. You can see that the debt as a percentage of GDP of South Korea as of the latest data in 2022 was just 54.33%. This is very, very low, especially compared to many other major developed economies out there. Here's a comparative data from the same source which shows the debt to GDP of advanced economies. You can see that it's nearly double that of South Korea. There are only a few developed countries out there today which have low government debt to GDP like South Korea. One example is Germany, which only has a debt to GDP of 66.54%. But it is still higher than South Korea. So, this raises the question, why? Why is South Korea's general government debt to GDP so low? Or a rather more important question to ask is, how did South Korea even grow so fast and big despite the usage of low debt? Government debt is, after all, used as a way to stimulate one's economy. For instance, in Japan, a country with the world's largest holder of debt to GDP has often used government debt to stimulate its economy, particularly during times of stagnation or recession. This is one of the reasons why Japan's debt to GDP has risen so fast in just a small amount of time, as the government wanted to keep funding various initiatives to revive its sluggish economy. But, as it turned out, the debt grew much faster than the economy itself, and is now posing some risks to Japan's economy. South Korea, on the other hand, is an outlier. Its GDP per capita, a measurement of the average income per person, has risen significantly over the decades, surpassing many developed countries out there while using minimal debt. Here's a comparative graph of the GDP per capita of South Korea and a select economies. You can see that South Korea's GDP per capita, as of the latest data for 2023, as published by the World Bank, is nearly as much as Japan, with other metrics even showing that it is higher than Japan. It is also much higher than China, which has a general government debt of over 77.1%. However, it is important to know that while South Korea's usage of debt is low, it still had strong government intervention, especially at the start of its economic miracle. Now, why is this the case? Well, first we need to understand the factors that drive a country's government to rise. This lies in the concept called fiscal management. It is how a government spends, borrows, and manages its finances. Here's a table for the National Fiscal Management Plan from 2023 to 2027, as published in August of 2023 by the Ministry of Economy and Finance of South Korea. There are two important indicators here. The first is government revenues, and the second is expenditures. So, what are government revenues? Government revenues are what the government gets from its country. This is mostly done through taxes. It's how they collect taxes from people, corporations, and the many various forms of taxes out there. The second here is expenditures. Expenditures are how a government spends money. Here's a separate table on what they spent on their 2023 budget. As you can see, it's divided by several expenditures, like 226 trillion Korean won goes to health, welfare, employment. 96 trillion won goes to education, and even 57 trillion won goes to national defense. It is in this instance that drives a country's government debt to rise. Whenever a government spends more money than they generate, that is what we call a fiscal deficit, and to fund that fiscal deficit, they must borrow money. You can tell from the table already that they will borrow money to fund the deficit from this plan of 2023 to 2027. This is the simplistic view of how a government's debt rises. Of course, there are other causes out there. For instance, in COVID-19, we saw governments all across the world borrowing money to stimulate their own economies. South Korea had unveiled several measures worth billions of dollars to cushion the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, for instance, they had unveiled an extra $29 billion in extra budget for small businesses and another $12 billion in 2022 to these small businesses and self-employed individuals. So, is this bad? Well, it is very normal around the world. Every country, globally, or at least most countries, are spending more than they generate from revenues. This is normal, as governments often face pressures to address immediate economic challenges, improve infrastructure, or fund social programs. But where South Korea stands out is that their fiscal deficit isn't as bad as many other economies out there. Their managed fiscal balance, as you can see from the 2023 to 2027 Fiscal Management Plan, ranges from a deficit of 2.5% to 3.9%, and their Consolidated Fiscal Balance Plan is far smaller, which ranges from a deficit of 0.5% to 1.9%. But what's the difference between a managed fiscal balance and Consolidated Fiscal Balance Plan? Well, a managed fiscal balance includes all government revenues and expenditures, including borrowing. It shows the overall financial health of the government, including funds used for investments or emergencies. On the other hand, a consolidated fiscal balance focuses only on core government operations, excluding certain funds like Social Security or investment returns. This gives a clearer picture of the government's day-to-day spending. Let's compare the fiscal management data of South Korea to other countries. Here's a graph with data published by the International Monetary Fund on the primary balance as a percentage of GDP. Primary balance focuses on a government's revenues and spending without including interest payments on debt. It shows the underlying fiscal effort. As you can see, South Korea's primary balance has actually been positive from 2010 to 2018. It only went negative starting from 2019 to 2024. Despite that, it's not really that big. Let's add Japan to this graph here. As you can see, Japan's primary balance is more on the negative side compared to South Korea. In 2020, South Korea's primary balance as a percentage of GDP was just negative 2.56%, whereas Japan was over negative 8.42%. This implies that South Korea has managed its fiscal policy much more effectively than Japan, even during challenging times like the COVID-19 pandemic. To put it all into simplicity, South Korea's government debt is low because their government don't really spend a lot more than their revenues. And the reason why South Korea's debt to GDP is also low, despite the government having fiscal deficit, is because the economy is growing much faster than the rate of debt borrowings. But this doesn't really mean that South Korea's debt will always be low. It's actually expected to go up as reported by this 2023 to 2027 National Fiscal Management Plan. Here's the table we used earlier, and add the government debt to GDP from 2023 to 2027. As you can see, the debt to GDP as published by the Ministry of Economy and Finance is expected to grow from 50.4% in 2023 to 53% by 2027. But it is important to know that these are mere projections. They can eventually change. For instance, you can see that the data here for 2024 is projected at 51% government debt to GDP in 2024, but in a year later, as the actual data was released, the government debt to GDP actually shrunk to 47.4%, as published by the Ministry of Economy and Finance in August of 2024. Now, you might think that this is all because of good fiscal management, right? Well, they do indeed play a role. But one more interesting facet here is the fact that South Korea doesn't really have a big budget. It actually has one of the lowest expenditures to GDP. Here's a graph with data published by the International Monetary Fund on expenditures as a percentage of GDP on Fiscal Monitor. You can see that South Korea's expenditure in 2024 is just 22.64%. It is way lower than the advanced economies with 40.6%. Japan's expenditure in 2024 is over 42.2%. This means that South Korea spends far less as a percentage of its economy compared to other advanced countries. Having lower government spending means South Korea doesn't need to borrow as much to fund its budget. In contrast, countries like Japan and many Western nations spend a much larger portion of their GDP on things like social programs, healthcare, and public services, which often leads to higher borrowing and larger deficits. The reason for this low spending is because South Korea has focused on targeted spending rather than expansive budgets. Instead of funding large welfare programs or other high-cost initiatives, the government prioritizes investments in areas like infrastructure, education, and technology. These are sectors that directly contribute to economic growth, making every dollar spent more impactful. Additionally, South Korea's cultural emphasis on self-reliance means that people rely less on government support for things like pensions and healthcare compared to other advanced economies. For example, Japan's aging population demands high social spending, which significantly increases its budget. But it is important to know, as South Korea sees an aging population, they may also see high social spending in the future. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.